Welcome to another deep dive into serial killer files by Skoob. I'm your host, Arthur Morgan, and today we're exploring one of the most enigmatic and tragic stories in cult history, Heaven's Gate. This isn't just another true crime story. This is a tale of spiritual seeking gone wrong, of charismatic leadership, of technology meeting mysticism, and ultimately, of 39 souls who believed they were catching a ride to the stars. But before we get to that tragic ending in March 1997, we need to understand how it all began. Because Heaven's Gate didn't start as a death cult. It began with hope, with spiritual yearning, and with two individuals who convinced themselves and others that they held the keys to human transcendence. Picture this. It's April 9th, 1975. The Vietnam War is winding down. Watergate has shattered trust in government, and America is in the midst of a spiritual awakening. In Los Angeles, a metaphysical group is gathering at the home of psychic Joan Culpepper. They're followers of a man named Clarence Klug, who preaches something called self-initiation, an alchemical practice designed to transform ordinary humans into beings of pure light. Klug's teachings were a fascinating blend of Christian revelation, Hindu mysticism, and ancient alchemy. He taught his followers about chakras, those energy centers running up the spine, and incorporated Hindu Tantra, promising mystical experiences through controlled sexual practices. For his inner circle, these weren't just theories, they were the secrets to transcending human limitations entirely. But here's the thing about spiritual communities built on grand promises. They're fragile. By 1975, Klug's group was falling apart. Membership was dropping, money was running out from a failed attempt to publish Klug's teachings, and worse yet, the community was eating itself alive with gossip, conflict, and doubt. Members were terrified that maybe Klug was wrong. Terrified that they were missing their shot at spiritual evolution. Terrified that someone else might have the real answers. Enter two mysterious figures who called themselves Guinea and Pig, though they would soon be known as Bo and Peep. On that April evening, they walked into Klug's gathering and everything changed. The accounts varied depending on who you ask, the two themselves, the attendees, or later investigators. But everyone agrees on one thing. This was the moment Heaven's Gate was truly born. Between 41 and 80 people attended that meeting, and what happened next was remarkable. Bo and Peep presented their message with such compelling charisma that somewhere between 23 and 27 people, nearly a third of those present, decided to follow these strangers into the unknown. Think about that for a moment. These weren't desperate, homeless individuals. These were spiritual seekers who had been preparing for something exactly like this. The timing was perfect. Klug's followers were already primed for transcendence, already believing in transformation beyond human limitations, already steeped in the idea that ancient secrets could unlock divine potential. When Bo and Peep arrived with their eclectic teachings that promised not just spiritual evolution, but literal physical transformation and transportation to a higher realm, it was like a key fitting perfectly into a lock that had been waiting to turn. This wasn't random. This wasn't coincidence. This was the confluence of spiritual hunger, community crisis, and charismatic leadership that would set in motion one of America's most infamous religious movements. Now you might be wondering, who were Bo and Peep really? Their real names were Marshall Herff Applewhite and Bonnie Lou Nettles, and understanding their charismatic hold over their followers is crucial to understanding how Heaven's Gate operated for over 2 decades. Charisma is a funny thing. The sociologist Max Weber defined it as a remarkable trait that sets someone apart from ordinary people, the perception of supernatural, superhuman, or uniquely exceptional abilities. Notice that word, perception. Charisma isn't necessarily about having actual special powers. It's about others believing you do. And boy, Did Applewhite and Nettles have that effect on people? Former members consistently described their leaders as possessing unique, almost otherworldly qualities. One member, who would later be known as Todoti, described his first encounter with Doe, that's what they called Applewhite, in almost mystical terms. He said it felt like questions would form in his mind, and Doe would address them directly, as if reading his thoughts. Despite sitting in the back of a packed auditorium, Todoti felt like he was alone in a metaphysical tunnel with Doe. But here's what's fascinating about Heaven's Gate, and this sets them apart from many cult leaders. They actually told doubtful people to leave. This wasn't your typical high-pressure recruitment scenario. If someone seemed uncertain, the leaders would literally advise them to go. This selective approach meant they attracted only the most dedicated spiritual seekers. Think of it like a luxury brand strategy. High demands, high rewards, premium pricing. It doesn't appeal to everyone, but it creates intense loyalty among those it does attract. Heaven's Gate promised the ultimate reward, literally transcending humanity and traveling to a higher level of existence. But they demanded everything in return. Your possessions, your relationships, your identity, your sexuality, eventually even your life. This rational choice model helps explain why Heaven's Gate remained relatively small but incredibly committed. These people didn't join because they were brainwashed or manipulated in some mysterious way. They joined because they were actively seeking something extraordinary, and they believed they found it. But charisma alone wasn't enough. Remarkably, many members who joined later never even met Nettles or Applewhite in person. What really held the group together wasn't just the leaders' personalities. It was the content of their teachings, their beliefs and practices, that gave structure and meaning to their followers' quest for transcendence. The members stayed not just because they were dazzled by charismatic leaders, but because leaving would mean giving up their connection to something they believed was truly beyond the ordinary. They had found their purpose, their path to the stars, and they weren't about to let it go. Every religious movement faces moments of crisis, but few face anything quite like what Heaven's Gate experienced on June 18th or 19th, 1985, the death of Bonnie Lou Nettles, known to followers as Ty. This wasn't supposed to happen. The entire theology of Heaven's Gate was built on the premise that the faithful would be physically taken aboard UFOs in a rapture-like event. Death wasn't part of the plan. They were all supposed to transcend together, bodies and all, traveling to the literal kingdom of heaven in the stars. Nettles' death from liver cancer didn't just contradict their beliefs. It shattered the very foundation of their eschatological vision. The circumstances surrounding her death were shrouded in ambiguity. She had been fighting various cancers for over a year, had lost an eye to cancer in 1982, and according to former member Sawyer, had been in considerable pain. Some members knew she was ill, but her actual death remained inconceivable to her followers. After all, how could someone destined to lead humanity to the next level simply die? Applewhite was devastated. According to Sawyer, he expressed his profound grief, but recognized that he had a mission to complete, the task he and Nettles had started together. This moment could have spelled the end of Heaven's Gate. Cognitive dissonance was tearing through the group as their long-standing beliefs crashed against reality. But Applewhite proved to be a masterful theologian under pressure. Instead of admitting failure, he reframed Nettles' death as the first successful transition to the next level. He explained that the gap between her advanced consciousness and her body's genetic limitations had caused her physical form to deteriorate. She hadn't died. She had evolved beyond the need for a physical body and was now waiting for them in the next level. This theological pivot was brilliant and devastating in equal measure. It introduced a radical mind-body dualism that borrowed from neo-Calvinistic concepts like election and predestination. Suddenly, physical death wasn't the end. It could be a doorway. The implications were staggering. The group began reconsidering the physical limits of human bodies for space travel and next-level tasks. Maybe they didn't need to take their earthly vehicles with them. Maybe the UFOs would provide new, superior bodies. They were careful to clarify that they weren't promoting suicide. Not yet. But the seeds were planted. Former member Nettles later remarked that Nettles' death confused Applewhite, though this comment likely minimized the severe emotional impact. Members Mr. Cody and Sir Fody described the ordeal as exceptionally challenging for everyone, a harsh trial of faith that tested the very core of their beliefs. But Applewhite's theological restructuring worked. He managed to prevent Heaven's Gate from collapsing by elevating Nettles to divine status. She became the father figure to his Jesus-like role. This wasn't entirely unprecedented. The group had already reinterpreted their beliefs before when their predicted martyrdom and resurrection from Revelation 11 failed to materialize. What emerged from this crisis was a more dangerous Heaven's Gate, one that now saw physical death not as failure, but as potential graduation. The movement that had begun with promises of physical rapture had evolved into something that could ultimately justify the unthinkable. So who were the people willing to give up everything for a chance to catch a ride on a UFO? The popular narrative often portrays cult members as broken, desperate people who were somehow tricked or brainwashed. But the reality of Heaven's Gate membership is far more complex and honestly, more relatable than most of us would care to admit. Let me tell you about Tadady, and yes, all Heaven's Gate members adopted those strange six-letter names ending in Odi. His story is fascinating because he's actually a boomerang member, someone who joined in the early years, left, and then came back in the 1990s. Tadody's initial encounter with the teachers, as he called them, felt like fate. He described sitting in that meeting, questions forming in his mind, only to hear Dudu address those exact thoughts moments later. It was like being in a metaphysical tunnel, with Du at one end and himself at the other. He joined, dedicated 3 years of his life to the movement, then left to explore the world. But here's the key. His return wasn't driven just by some mystical calling. It was driven by profound dissatisfaction with ordinary life. He described the world as harsh, aggressive, mean-spirited, and unpleasant. During his time away, he faced harassment, physical violence, deceit, threats, theft, and abuse. He tried other spiritual paths, but found them empty. "I've traversed many paths, tried it all, and nothing worked," he said in his final video. This pattern was remarkably common among the 1990s joiners. Take Custode. His name literally came from being on a spiritual quest. He described his pre-Heaven's Gate spiritual journey as leading to frustration instead of enlightenment. He criticized other religious beliefs as programmed puppets worshiping false myths, rituals, foolish belief systems, and fake fantasy gods. These weren't weak-minded individuals. They were intense spiritual seekers who had become profoundly alienated from conventional society. Custode described feelings of anger, alienation, hopelessness, and incompleteness so severe he felt on the brink of a metaphorical coma, desperately clinging to prayer to maintain hope in what he perceived as a space alien hell. Notice that phrase, space alien hell. This reveals something crucial about Heaven's Gate's worldview. They believed Earth was controlled by malevolent space aliens, making their sense of alienation not just valid, but cosmically correct. For people who felt fundamentally out of place in the world, this was incredibly appealing. Heaven's Gate told them their alienation was proof they were special, that they were souls from the next level, trapped in a corrupted world. Guldodi joined just 3 years before the group's mass suicide. He'd been searching for spiritual truth for years before being introduced to the movement through flyers and posters. W. Onodi, who joined in 1994, described her previous life experiences as necessary preparation that allowed her to eventually meet the requirements to graduate from this human kingdom to the next level. This is the pattern: intensive spiritual seeking, deep dissatisfaction with conventional life, a sense of cosmic alienation, and then the relief of finding a group that not only validated these feelings, but promised a literal escape route from the human condition entirely. These people weren't victims in the traditional sense. They were spiritual athletes, pushing themselves to extremes in pursuit of transcendence. The tragedy is that their legitimate spiritual hunger was ultimately channeled toward destruction rather than genuine growth. By the mid-1990s, something revolutionary was happening in America. The World Wide Web was exploding into public consciousness. In 1995, only about 25 million Americans, roughly 3% of the population, were using the Internet, and there were only about 20,000 websites in existence. But Heaven's Gate saw the potential immediately. Here's something remarkable. Heaven's Gate was genuinely pioneering in their use of Internet technology for religious outreach. While other religious groups were still focused on traditional media, these UFO believers were building websites, posting on Usenet news groups, and incorporating URLs into their recruitment efforts. They were digital prophets trying to spread their cosmic message through fiber optic cables. But their reception was, well, let's just say the Internet wasn't ready for their brand of salvation. Their alien-themed posts on Usenet were met with ridicule and dismissal. One user from New Zealand called their messages obvious dribble and urged everyone to keep such content out of the forums. Others mocked them with distorted quotes from The Day the Earth Stood Still, treating their communications like science fiction nonsense. An astronomer at the University of San Francisco challenged them directly, demanding proof of their extraterrestrial claims and stating his own belief in divine creation. The responses from Star Trek news groups were particularly brutal. Users called their posts the dumbest thing they'd encountered and questioned why such messages belonged on any platform at all. The numbers tell the story of their failure to connect. Less than 12 people responded to all their posts combined. Many threads received no replies whatsoever. For a group that believed they were offering humanity its last chance for salvation, this apathy must have been devastating. In their internal analysis, Heaven's Gate concluded that the public wasn't ready for their message, that their exposure to these ideas was too early for their time. But they kept trying, posting through August and September of 1996, encountering the same dismissive responses. One former member later told researchers that these online struggles led the group to conclude that direct interfacing with the wider world wasn't achievable. They were becoming increasingly isolated, convinced that humanity had rejected its final opportunity for transcendence. Their website, initially at the now-defunct address www.indirect.com/www/Lilo, later moved to heavensgate.com in 1996. This became one of their last major efforts to reach a global audience. Unfortunately, their original website content wasn't preserved, so we can only imagine what those early digital sermons looked like. The earliest archived version of their homepage only dates back to December 22, 1996, just months before their final exit. Think about the irony here. Heaven's Gate was ahead of its time technologically, but their message felt ancient and alien to the early Internet community. They were using cutting-edge technology to spread beliefs about UFOs, ancient spirits, and cosmic transcendence to a world that was just beginning to explore email and basic web browsing. This digital rejection reinforced their growing belief that Earth was truly corrupted, that humanity had chosen the path of the lower forces, and that their only option was to abandon this world entirely. The Internet, which they had hoped would be their salvation, instead became proof of humanity's spiritual bankruptcy. As we reach the end of our journey through Heaven's Gate's story, we need to understand how a group that began with hope and spiritual aspiration ended in such tragedy. The transformation wasn't sudden. It was a gradual evolution spanning over 2 decades, shaped by failed prophecies, theological adaptations, social isolation, and ultimately, a leader's grief-stricken reinterpretation of what salvation actually meant. After Nettles' death in 1985, the group's theology underwent that crucial transformation we discussed earlier. Physical death was no longer failure. It could be graduation. But it took another decade for this theological possibility to become practical reality. The catalyst was their growing conviction that Earth had rejected its final chance for salvation. Their failed internet outreach wasn't just disappointing, it was prophetic confirmation. If humanity wouldn't listen to their digital missionaries, if the world continued to choose materialism over transcendence, if even the technologically savvy early adopters of the internet dismissed their cosmic message, then clearly the window for earthly salvation was closing. The approaching Hale-Bopp comet became the final sign they were waiting for. Here was their spaceship, their chariot to the next level, visible to anyone with eyes to see. But of course, the rest of humanity dismissed it as just another astronomical event. This confirmed what Heaven's Gate had come to believe, that most human souls were too corrupted, too controlled by malevolent space aliens, too invested in earthly pleasures to recognize their salvation when it appeared in the sky. Applewhite, now the sole leader and known as Dew, faced the ultimate test of his theological evolution. Tia was waiting for them in the next level. The spaceship was approaching. The window of opportunity was closing. The only question left was whether he and his followers had the courage to leave their earthly vehicles behind and make the journey to their true home. From their perspective, what happened in March 1997 wasn't suicide. It was graduation. They weren't ending their lives. They were beginning their true existence. They carefully planned their departure, recorded farewell videos explaining their joy at finally being able to join T, and methodically shed their earthly forms to board the spacecraft trailing Hale-Bopp. The tragedy of Heaven's Gate isn't just that 39 people died. It's that their genuine spiritual hunger, their authentic seeking for meaning beyond the material world, their legitimate sense that something was profoundly wrong with ordinary human existence, all of this was ultimately channeled toward destruction rather than genuine transcendence. These weren't weak or stupid people. They were intense spiritual athletes who pushed themselves to extremes in pursuit of something greater than themselves. In another context with different leadership, their dedication and willingness to sacrifice for their beliefs might have led to genuine spiritual growth, to meaningful service, to lives that enrich both themselves and others. Instead, their story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of charismatic leadership, the problems of absolute certainty in spiritual matters, and the tragic potential of sincere seeking when it becomes disconnected from wisdom, community accountability, and basic human grounding. Heaven's Gate reminds us that the impulse toward transcendence, toward something greater than ordinary life, is fundamentally human and often admirable. The tragedy lies not in the seeking, but in how that seeking can be misdirected by leaders who mistake their own psychological needs for cosmic revelation, by communities that choose isolation over engagement, and by belief systems that see death as preferable to the messy, imperfect, but ultimately precious business of being human. As we close the chapter on Heaven's Gate, we're left with unsettling questions about belief, belonging, and the human longing for something beyond the ordinary. What began in 1975 as a hopeful search for transformation slowly evolved into one of the most shocking tragedies in modern spiritual history. These weren't outsiders to society. They reflected familiar desires, meaning, purpose, transcendence, and certainty in an uncertain world. Their story forces us to confront a chilling truth. How thin is the line between devotion and delusion? And what really happens when absolute belief meets charismatic authority and isolation? But there are deeper layers to Heaven's Gate that most retellings never reveal. Hidden details, unexplored motives, and disturbing, unanswered questions. Download the Skoob app now to get access to the full story and uncover the details that history books rarely discuss.